This is kind of like a tell-all, but in no way. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today I am bringing you through all of the books that I finished in November as part of the Get a Clue Readathon. This Readathon ran for the whole of November and it was run by Rainey from Rainy Blue Reads, and I was on Team Plum and the captains there were Brie from Four Paws in a Book and Leandra from Leandra the TBR Zero, and I swear we had the best month. Everybody chipped in as much as we could, we all read as many books as we could, and we managed to do pretty well in it. I think Team Plum won 7 out of the 9 rounds that were there, so we had a pretty high chance of actually solving the murder. Across the whole month of November, I read 11 books and I DNF'd 2. Every single one of the 11 books that I read was catered for an adult reading audience instead of a YA or of a middle grade. As for the genres, I read 3 romance books, 5 contemporary books, 1 magical realism, and 2 mystery books. I wanted to read a couple more murder mysteries across November because you did get 100 bonus points for reading a book that had a murder mystery in it, but the apples just didn't fall that way. I read 5 ebooks with a total of 1,352 pages, and I listened to 6 audiobooks, accounting for a total of 67 listening hours across the month. I gave 1 book a 4.5 star rating, I gave 3 4 stars out, 6 books got a 3.5 star rating, and there was 1 book that got a 3 star rating. As I said, I actually DNF'd 2 further books that don't count to any of those stats. And the first book that I DNF'd in the month was The Wakeup Call by Beth O'Leary, and unfortunately, this did not work for me as much as I was anticipating it and as much as I was excited for it. It followed Isabel and Lucas, who were the front desk people at a hotel which was kind of going through a tough time. It was not as frequented as it had been in the past, and it was looking like it was going to be closing down. Kind of get everything in order, Isabel and Lucas go through the stockroom and find all of the things in the lost and found and decide that they are going to either throw them out or try and give them to charity shops, or if they can, give them back to the original owner. When they come across a wedding ring that they can reunite with the owner gives the hotel a huge cash bonus. And the two of them decide this is something that we can do with the other wedding rings that are in the box. So they go around trying to ring people to see if they had lost a wedding ring while they were there, or trying to reunite them in some other way with the possible owners. And I just lost any kind of love with this book about halfway through. It felt like it was going nowhere. It was super long. It was really drawn out, and I wasn't intrigued by it. I was also listening to the audiobook of this, and in the book, Lucas is Brazilian and he has come over to the UK to live and to work. And I had a bit of a struggle with Lucas's narrator in the audiobook. I felt like every time we were in Lucas's point of view, I had to slow the reading down so much to try and actually get to terms with what he was saying and to try and pick up what was going on. I just kind of lost my way with this book. It didn't really stand out to me as much as other Beth O'Leary books have, so maybe this is time to say goodbye. My other DNF was A Little Hope by Francine Beaton. This seemed like a really nice Christmas novella to get me started, but it just didn't work out for me. This was a self-published book, and immediately upon reading it, I could tell that this was self-published. There were a lot of pretty glaring typos in this book. There were a lot of words that had been left out, that it made no sense in the sentence anymore. And I found that this was happening so much that it was putting me off reading the book, because in my head I had to correct what was happening. I also felt like the dialogue between the 2 main characters, whose names I can barely remember, I feel like the dialogue between the 2 of them was really unnatural and really forced. For 2 characters who are in their mid to late 20s, they were reading like they were in their 50s, the way that they spoke to each other. It didn't feel natural. It didn't feel like what people of that age would say. It didn't feel like the way that they would naturally speak to one another. What I did like was that the 2 characters were from South Africa and that they had both moved to the UK for different reasons. The book was set in Glasgow. It was obviously set around Christmas time, but I would have loved to see a little bit more of Glasgow at Christmas time brought out. Maybe if I had gotten further into the book, that's something that I would have noticed and that's something that I would have seen. But as the book stood, it just didn't make me want to get that far. So, how did Professor Plum do in this readathon, and what was our path through the rooms throughout the clue board? Well, we started in the study, and in the study you had to read a book that had a school setting. That makes a lot of sense when you think about where we were. And luckily I had a book that was on my winter TBR that fit this like an absolute dream. I picked up Icebreaker by Hannah Grace, and I did not enjoy it. I think this was one of the most disappointing books of me for the year because it was so heavily anticipated. I was so looking forward to it, and I had purposely avoided any kind of reviews or any TikToks about it or listening to any podcasts about it, and I had them specifically saved up for when I had finished the book. And now I kind of wish that I had. The book is following Anastasia and Nate, who are going to the same college in Maple Hills. And Anastasia is a figure skater and Nate is the captain of the school's hockey team. When one of the rinks at the school is vandalized, both the hockey team and the figure skaters have to practice for their competitions on the same rink. So there is a little bit of animosity between Nate and Anastasia, which is instantly put to the side. I think they have like this hatred for each other for maybe 2 pages, and then they get into this kind of circle of seeing each other and hooking up, and then seeing each other and then hooking up again. There wasn't really any development of feelings between the two of them. It was all just instantly. There were scenes that felt so incredulous to me. There was a scene of them hooking up in the back of an Uber that just completely felt out of the scope of reality. There was a scene in a bedroom that felt a little bit out of the scope of reality too. I was so disappointed by some of this book, but there was a big thread that happened throughout the entirety of this book where Anastasia spoke about some personal experience that she had happened and how she wanted that to kind of develop into how she had a family when she was older and what she would do with her children. And then that was completely brushed to the side by the end of the epilogue. And I just looked at this book for about 5 minutes, stared at it, and then put my head in my hands for the rest of the evening. I just could not understand how we had gone down this road, and this felt like a really nice way for us to go, and then all of a sudden we were being dragged in a completely different direction so hard I almost got whiplash. As I said, this was one of the biggest disappointments for me across the entirety of 2023, and this was the lowest rated book of the entire month. It did, however, pick up spectacularly for the billiard room, which is where we went to next, and you needed to read a book that had a sports setting in it. I'm not going to talk to you about the book that I had read for the billiards room because it is published by St. Martin's Press. Instead, I am going to recommend to you to have a little look about why we're not particularly speaking about books from this publisher anymore, and maybe take a look at some other books that you can check out instead. So, when we left the billiard room, we went into the library and we needed to read a book that had an adaptation in it, and this is where my best book of the month came in. I read One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and I knew that I was in safe hands straight away because it was a Taylor Jenkins Reid book, but I don't think I could have pictured just how safe I was. This book is following Emma, who, when she is 17, meets a guy called Jesse at school and instantly falls in love with him. Emma and Jesse are high school sweethearts. They stay together for years and they end up getting married to one another. However, on the 1-year anniversary of their wedding, Jesse goes on assignment to some of the islands off the coast of Alaska and his helicopter goes missing. Jesse is presumed missing, presumed dead, and Emma's life basically falls apart. Her family help her to bring herself back to herself. She gets a new job that she gets to put her mind on, and she reignites a flame with a guy that she had been with in her school years before Jesse and she had gotten together. 2 years after the helicopter had gone missing, Jesse turns up on Emma's front door. She is now in a completely different relationship with this guy, Sam, that she had known when she was younger. Her life is in a completely different place. She is living in a different town. She is working in a different career. She has a different partner. He is even her fiance. And I felt like this was such a fantastic discussion of how a relationship changes you, of how different relationships, be they platonic, be they familial, be they romantic, can change you and can mold you into a different person. For example, I had so many inside jokes in my previous relationship that belonged to that previous relationship and belonged to the person that I was at the time. And now the one that I am in right now has different inside jokes and has different things that we do together. And they belong to that relationship, and these two people very rarely cross paths. In the similar vein, I have friends that I speak to about this, I have friends that I speak to about this, I have friends that I do this with, I have friends that I do this with, and I don't tend to speak to the other friends about that or do that with the other friends. And when Jesse came back, I think it was that he had no idea how different Emma's life would be. He had no idea how different some of her coping mechanisms would be. Some of the things that she enjoyed doing in the evenings when she was free after work would be. There's things that she would have never done before, but now that she's a different person in a different stage of her life, these are the bedbone of her reality. I was a little bit apprehensive when we got to the end of it, because as a love triangle, there was basically only one outcome that there could be. She had to either go with guy A or guy B, and I am so thankful with who it ended up that she went with. I felt like this was the perfect ending to the story that I had been reading. I felt like it was the appropriate ending to the story that I had been reading. And I think it would have just worked out better for Emma in the end. Then it was into the conservatory, and here we had to read a book that had a non-human character in it. And for this one, I read the fourth book in the Before the Coffee Gets Cold series. This was Before We Say Goodbye, and again it is following Funicula, this little tiny cafe in a back alley in Tokyo that has a special secret. If you sit in a specific chair once a day, you can travel in time, either backwards or forwards, and you can meet somebody who has already been to the cafe that you know, that you want to tell something to, that you want to have a little bit more time with. And you get to stay there, you get to spend a little bit more time with them until the coffee that you have ordered at the beginning of your time has gone cold. There are a couple of other stipulations, there are a couple of other rules. And to be honest, when you've read all 4 books in the series, and when you've read them in relatively quick succession, as I had, reading the rules again and again, it starts to become a little bit repetitive. It starts to become a little bit, I mean, I already know this. Why are you telling me this 20 times in the one book? And it did feel a little bit like we were being told the same thing 20 times in the same book. I know that for people who are just coming to the series for the first time and who might be picking up book 2 as their first book or book 4 as their first book, they need to have some kind of an anchoring idea as to what's happening in the cafe. But I felt like for me and for other people who would have read the cover to cover series, it's probably a little bit too much. Like all of the other books in the series, this one had a kind of an underlying theme for all 4 of the stories that we are reading here. And this one, it was the idea of, as the title may give you an idea, saying goodbye. There was a husband who wanted to say goodbye to his wife again for the final time. There was a woman who never got to say goodbye to her dog before he passed away. And I think that was the story that stuck with me the most. The story about a pet owner who never got to say goodbye to their pets. Since having moved to Germany, I've had to say goodbye to 4 of my family's pets without having been there, without having been in the room. And it is heartbreaking to say goodbye to them, but it's almost worse to say goodbye to them from a different country. So, truly and honestly, when we got to the end of the story of Apollo the dog and his owner saying goodbye to him one more time and kind of getting rid of the guilt of having not been there when he had passed away, I was in floods of tears. It's such an impactful story, and it's the one that's going to stay with me for the longest of any of the other 4 stories. But that is not to say that the other ones in this collection are not just as heartwarming and heartbreaking. So, after we left the conservatory, we headed for the lounge, where you needed to have a book that had all of the letters in your name on the cover somewhere, either in the title or in the author's name or in the kind of blurbs of reviews that were on there. I spent a while looking through my bookshelf until I got to Finlay Donovan Knocks Them Dead by El Cosimano. I had read the first book in this with Bree from Four Paws in a Book as a buddy read last July, and this felt like a good time to get into the second one. We're left on a kind of a cliffhanger, and a very interesting one, at the end of the first book, and this book brings us along that kind of journey where Finlay is trying to stop the murder of somebody very close to her. There's a lot of discussion here about online forums and anonymous online forums, and I have to tell you, I did not enjoy the outcome of one of the people on that forum. It felt so far-fetched, it felt a little bit completely out of left field for me, and once I got to that stage, I actually had to go back over the book and ask if that was what I was really reading. Ask if that's where the story was really genuinely going to, because it just felt like it was so out of left field. To use my own phrase, and with a little bit of disappointment, this is truly a book that exists and I read it. I don't particularly remember a whole lot about what happened in this book. It didn't grasp me as much as the first one did, unfortunately, and I don't know if I'm going to continue on with the second book in this series. I've actually already unhauled both of my copies of them. I've given them to a friend of mine to have a look at, and I don't know if I'm going to even want to ask for them back. I'm not entirely sure this is one that I would reread ever again, and I'm not entirely sure if I'd go on to the next one in the series. Then Team Plum went into the hall where we needed to read a book that had multiple perspective in it. And for this one, I picked up My Hot Friend by Sophie White. This book is about three women, Lexi, Claire, and Joanne. And all of them are in very different stages of their lives. Lexi is a super popular podcaster. She runs a podcast called Your Hot Friend with her best friend Amanda. But things are starting to sour between the two of them. The relationship isn't as good as it had previously been, both professionally and personally, and Lexi is starting to notice the rift between the two of them is widening and widening with every single day and with every single thing that Amanda posts online. Claire has noticed that her friend's WhatsApp group is starting to get quieter and quieter, and has now come to the conclusion that they have made an entire separate group without her to plan everything and to talk about her and to get together. And this is all solidified when her best friend Afric gets proposed to and starts planning a wedding. And Claire feels like she is only really being invited because she has been accidentally told these things are happening. As for Joanne, she's the first person of her friendship group to have a baby, and she's also going through a pretty obvious spell of postnatal depression. And I felt like this was written pretty well, but it was also really tough to read. It was really hard to see Joanne pushing away her entire friendship group or her partner, all because of how she was feeling, all because of the hormones that were kind of rushing through her body. To be honest, I felt like everyone in this book had terrible friends until the three of them met each other. And I have to say as well that for a book where we were told these three women get together and try to bring new friendships into their early 30s, I feel like the three of them met each other a little bit too late for me to get into the swing of their friendship. They didn't meet each other, or at least two of them didn't meet each other, until we got 41% into the book. And I feel like 2/5, almost a half, is just a little bit too late for me to get involved in this friendship. Of course, it did give them enough time for them to actually build a real friendship together, and I really enjoyed watching that. But I think I would have liked to have even started it a little bit earlier, into the 30% or maybe at the 25% mark. I just felt like for the first maybe 40% of it, it was going so slowly. I almost DNF'd it at several stages. There are also multiple references in this book to Claire's previous struggles with bipolar disorder. She had been hospitalized due to having bipolar disorder, and I felt like this was written with so much respect for Claire and for other people who are living with bipolar disorder. I felt like it was written so well and with so much respect for people like that. Also, I have to give Sophie White props for putting an Aoife into this book, but I kind of have to take the props back because the Aoife in this book was not a good person at all. After the haul, we left the dining room. Here you needed to read a book that was published in the month that you were born. So I was born in June, and that was a little bit of a hurdle for me because by that stage of November, I just wanted to read Christmas books, and there are no Christmas books published in June. I found something and I picked up Lucy Yee is Not a Romantic by Lauren Ho. I had heard really great things about this one and I was really intrigued by the concept of it, but I think the execution let me down a little bit. This is about Lucy, who is in her 30s and has gotten to the stage of her life where she wants to settle down, she wants to have children, but she is living single. She and her partner Mark broke up a couple of years ago after a miscarriage basically tore their relationship apart. And now Lucy is looking into alternate methods for her to become a mother. So she signs up for an app, which is kind of like Tinder, but for people who want to find somebody to have a child with. And here she matches with Colin, who seems to be a little bit too good to be true, but they meet up, they hit it off, they go on a couple of dates, and they fall pregnant. Something that I really did not enjoy about this book is that a couple of chapters before Lucy gets pregnant, we find out that she has got some issues with infertility. She has got a low egg count and she might struggle to conceive naturally, which is then completely blown out of the water when Lucy and Colin fall pregnant first time. I really hated reading that part of it, and it completely took me out of the story for a little bit because I felt like we could have gone into such a great discussion about infertility and about still trying to have a child even if you are suffering from some form of infertility, and then it was just laid to the side completely. Much like One True Loves, this also had a love triangle in it because as Lucy and Colin go back to Singapore to tell Lucy's family about the upcoming child and also to spend more time in Singapore as they plan to raise the baby there, Mark, Lucy's previous fiance, comes back onto the scene and they start to get a lot closer as well. I didn't love the direction that it seemed like this love triangle was going in, but by the end of the book, I think I was a little bit more on board with where Lauren Ho wanted to bring me. Overall, I think this book could have done a bit better with infertility and how it had been handling that. I think there was just a discussion that I really wanted to have happen that didn't happen in the pages of this book. And there were a couple of other things that I felt were swept under the rug or not really discussed that I just would have liked to have seen dealt with. After the dining room, we went to the ballroom where you needed to start another series, which was basically my least favorite prompt of the entire month because there is no reason for me to be going off and starting a whole other series again. But I kept with the spirit of it and I started The Worst Christmas Ever by Rebecca Paolini. This is the first book in the Southwest series and it is set in the southwest of England in a small little town called Totnes in Devon. In this book you are following Lee, who is a partner in a huge law firm by the time she's 30. She is married to a guy called Nathan and they have been together since they were basically children. But one evening she comes home, she's had a pretty horrific day at work, and it gets even worse because she finds Nathan in bed with another woman. She heads off into the wilderness. She basically escapes the place and runs to her sister Beth's apartment to spend the night with her. But on the way back to Bristol, she gets a little bit waylaid and ends up in the small town of Totnes. Here she meets with the townspeople and she falls in love with the atmosphere that it has and the cozy little Christmas vibes that the small town is giving, but also with the police constable called James, who she is starting to get really close to over the last while. I absolutely loved this book. I love a small town Christmas romance, so this was completely up my street. I really loved Gina, who was Lee's housemate when she was living down in Devon. I felt like Gina was such a breath of fresh air, and if I did continue on with the series, I would actually love to see a book of Gina's point of views dotted in there somewhere. I have a feeling that most of the rest of the series is actually going to be about Lee and about her setting up her home in the south of England and about her romance with James and where all of that is taking her. I really loved watching her being accepted by his family, spending Christmas with them, and the kind of push and pull that she has towards Bristol and towards Devon and the pros and cons that were in each place. I really loved this book. It actually surprised me how much I loved it. We finally went for the kitchen where you had to read a book that had food on the title, food in the cover. Food was a big part of the plot. And I went for Apples Don't Fall by Leanne Moriarty. This was a TBR vet for me. It had been on my shelf since about early 2022. It was a little bit longer than I think it needed to be. It clocked in at 464 pages. The audiobook was 18 and a half hours long. I think you could have easily cut that down to about 360 and you still would have gotten such an impactful book. This book is following the Delaney family. They are a huge tennis family in their community. There are 4 children in the family: Amy, Logan, Brooke and Troy, and all of them are coming with their own kind of worries and woes and relationship breakups and family problems and work problems. And then everything gets thrown asunder when Savannah, who comes to their parents' house for shelter after running away from an abusive boyfriend, Savannah and their mother Joy go missing. What follows for most of the book is the police investigation into Savannah and Joy's disappearance, if there was anything that Stan, who is Joy's husband, had to do with the disappearance, if there is a murder that has happened, if there's something more sinister that is lying underneath the covers. And when we got to the end and when we actually found out what was happened, I felt like I had wasted my time reading this book. I felt like I had been completely hoodwinked. I went into it expecting something a little bit darker, a little bit more atmospheric. I've read a lot of Leanne Moriarty's books before, so I know that she tends to write very dark, very twisty things. But this twist did not enjoy it at all. I did not enjoy the twist that we got in this book. I felt like it was a little bit of a cop-out by the end of this book. And I think it might be time for me to say goodbye to Leanne Moriarty, unfortunately. That was Team Professor Plum's pathway through the Get a Clue Readathon, and that was how we managed to find out who the murderer was. Did you also take part in the Get a Clue Readathon, and how did you do with your guess by the end of it? If you'd love to leave me a comment but you can't think of anything you'd like to say, then just leave me the detective emoji. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.